How could you let a game like Dispatch queerbait you? This feels like a mean-spirited question, like I'm kicking you when you're already down. Spoiler alert, the game is fully released and it ended with only 2 straight romance options. If you want to be gay, wait for Tomodachi Life. But why was there ever an expectation that Dispatch would let you be gay anyway? For those who are unaware, Dispatch is a choose-your-own-adventure game by Ad Hoc Studio, a team formed by and made up of many former members of Telltale Games, a since-dissolved developer known for making similar-style games throughout the 2010s. In it, you play as Robert Robertson, former superhero forced to retire when his suit was destroyed, now working as a superhero dispatcher with a team of reformed villains, in an effort to try and earn enough money to fix his suit and return to the action himself. Amidst choosing his adventure with dialogue and action choices, you also actively participate in the dispatching sections as more involved strategy, as well as hacking minigames. Relevant here though is that the 2 romances that ended up in the game, those with Blonde Blazer and Invisigal, were clearly established and foreshadowed throughout the first couple of episodes. Not only this, the romance element was heavily emphasized on the game's Steam page, with Blazer's first romance scene being extremely hard to miss. Following Telltale tradition, the game was released episodically. However, perhaps aware of why Telltale's formula eventually stopped working, instead of these episodes being spread over months, Dispatch was pretty hasty with 2 episodes every week between late October and mid-November 2025. Even with the episodic release schedule meaning that there was some room for guesswork, there was still so much writing on the wall for who was going to be romanceable and who wasn't, that surely any hope for Robert to romance a dude would have been completely gay brain rot induced grasping at straws. Well, there are 2 main arguments cited when explaining why there was a certain level of expectation for a gay romance in Dispatch. While they're both brought up just as often as each other, the first is significantly more convincing and, in my eyes, damning. On the other hand, the second is a lot more shaky, he said, she said, circumstantial, borderline rumour level. For context though, it makes sense to start strong. In late October 2025, after the first 4 episodes of Dispatch had been released, but before the final 4, a user on the official Ad Hoc Discord server asked if there were any plans for queer romance options, or if the game would remain with just hetero content. In response to this, Ad Hoc moderator Nick replies saying,
"All plans are laid and you'll have to see what happens in the next 4 episodes. Saying anything else would just be spoilers."
This, of course, stirred up quite a reaction. This isn't a negative response. This is coy, avoidant, teasing. Looking back on it knowing that there is nothing to come, the phrasing feels infuriating. But at the time, this must have imbued hope in those who were already hoping. There's a lot you can say to argue against this though. For example, Nick isn't promising anything, he's just saying he wants to avoid giving spoilers. However, if you want to avoid spoilers, surely that implies that there's something to spoil. If there's nothing to spoil, surely he knows that he can just say no. Or if you don't want to say no, then a white lie at least.
All they had to do was say that their budget was limited and choose to just focus on BB and Vizzy's romances. That would have been a much more genuine and respectful response, and even maintain interest from queer players by saying something like they would like to explore more opportunities in a potential sequel if the game is successful enough.
As long as you don't spiral down into some rant about modern agendas, most queer people won't get mad if you just confirm only having 2 straight romance options. However, in retrospect, this quote from Nick feels intentionally misleading. Well, actually that depends who Nick is. If Nick is, and no offense to social media managers, just a social media manager, he could at least claim some ignorance, and this level of ambiguity would be more justifiable. Lucky for me though, the answer was easy to find. Only one Nick is credited in Dispatch, Nick Herman. Also, the Ad Hoc Discord server is still alive, so I could just pop in and check. And sure enough, that was Nick Herman. So, that's our Nick. So, what is Nick Herman's job title? Sorry, titles. Nick Herman is Dispatch's director, executive producer, creative director, voice director, COO of Ad Hoc Studios, and the specific director of Dispatch episodes 1, 2, 4, 7 and 8. And amongst all of that, he still managed to find the time to moderate the Discord server too. Sorry to say, I don't think Nick can claim ignorance. You can't really claim ignorance on something you had so much influence over. So for members of the Discord server to see this from such a senior member of the dev team, you would maybe start to hallucinate something gay on the horizon, especially where Dispatch was at this point narratively, but more on that a little later. This statement, in a setting like this, feels like textbook queerbaiting, and I'm far from the only person to pick up on this.
That is textbook queerbaiting, heavily implying queerness and dodging questions about it in order to garner favour and interest with queer audiences. I do wish they would be upfront about the lack of gay romance options. It feels disingenuous, but I guess that's textbook queerbaiting.
I honestly think this would be enough to justify the backlash the game received. However, there was another piece of, and I use this phrase liberally, evidence that was being cited alongside it. At some point before Dispatch released, and before the episodes finished releasing, it had the LGBTQ+ tag on Steam. Allegedly. And this comes with plenty of caveats. The dominant narrative is that the Dispatch Steam page had the misleading tag for its whole pre-release period, and it was only removed by Ad Hoc once the final episode was released. This of course feeds into the angle that Ad Hoc were purposefully misleading queer audiences into thinking that they would be getting a gay romance option. But then the water gets very murky. Apparently only devs can add tags to games pre-release. But that's not true. Here's me tagging upcoming horror game Reanimal as LGBTQ+. I also use a Wayback Machine to see where the tag was showing up, but I couldn't find it. However, the Wayback Machine isn't great with storefronts anyway, so I don't really think it's a trustworthy source. But it's okay because I know that it was definitely showing up there at some point. How? This thread of anti-woke gamers debating how much Dispatch might offend their sensibilities before the game came out, where they explicitly reference a tag existing at some point pre-release.
Is this woke? It's got the LGBTQ label on it, so yeah, it's a safe bet.
So while we can be sure that the tag was showing up there at some point, we can't be sure exactly how it got there. But I'm sure that they could have gotten rid of it whenever they wanted, if they wanted to. Just because users can vote on tags showing up doesn't mean devs are stuck with these potentially incorrect tags on their game. Steam's tagging system is a little awkward, and it's part of the reason why I didn't really even want to bring up this point, since especially when compared to the Discord message, it's just so abstract. Most times when it's brought up, it just leads to a debate about the validity of the argument, and I think that's telling. However, it is cited just as often as people reference Herman's more direct Discord queerbaiting, so I couldn't just ignore it. But I'm not passive to the whims of these conversations, so I'm going to say something more conclusive. If it was just a Steam tagging ambiguity, then the allegations of baiting would be precarious at best. However, as supplementary evidence to something as egregious and misleading as Nick Herman's Discord message, you can see how it would inspire extra hope. Hey, the game's director, executive producer, creative director, voice director, and director of episodes 1, 2, 4, 7, and 8 teased gay romance, and I've also heard that it has the LGBT tag showing up on Steam. So yeah, I think it's a safe bet that the game will have gay romance. Sure, it's an optimistic attitude, but it's hardly baseless. But also, were they playing the same game? All this was happening halfway through. We were 4 episodes deep into an 8-episode game. There would have had to be some foundations to build off of, right? With Vizzy and Blonde Blazer being such clear choices, you'd think that if there were any eligible bachelors, we would have noticed them by episode 4. As it turns out, the end of episode 4 would have been pretty much exactly where any same-sex romance for Robert would have started, at least if we consider the potential candidates. I'm not going to go deep into a thought experiment of, imagine if this happened, imagine if it started like this, because there's plenty of fanfiction for that, I would know. What I will do though is contextualize the existing in-game relationships these men have with Robert, and explain why I believe that this could lead into a romance, especially considering the aforementioned potential baiting is far from delusional. I do feel a bit bad for lumping our first 2 candidates together, but if you've played Dispatch, you'll know that Waterboy and Phenomaman are parallels. During the 4th episode, after cutting a member of his team, Robert is given the choice to recruit either Waterboy or Phenomaman, and this choice, as you can imagine, will change the rest of the game quite significantly. While the overarching narrative will remain similar, you'll obviously get to see a lot more of the character you choose to recruit, Robert will get closer to them, and they'll have more of an arc throughout the rest of the story. This also means that you'll probably have a preference towards the character that you chose, which for me is Waterboy. So don't hesitate to call me biased when I say that I think he does have more chemistry with Robert, especially considering the context of just having finished episode 4. Since meeting him, Waterboy is shown to have a deep admiration for Robert, both before and after learning about his former hero identity. They're given these incredibly tender moments together where we see how Robert grows more and more protective over the rookie, and this culminates with Robert's pep talk in the janitor closet at the end of episode 4, after Waterboy's disastrous first shift. The way Robert inspires Waterboy's renewed confidence, and the way Waterboy responds, I wouldn't be surprised if this interaction is what prompted that Discord user to ask if there would be any gay romance going forward, because this kind of feels like what would have been the establishing scene. And sure, I play favourites, but I don't want to fully ignore Phenomaman. Hell, he's Robert's only male kiss in the game, of course with the caveat being that this kiss is completely devoid of romance and played for laughs. However, while Robert's relationship with Phenomaman isn't as soft as his one with Waterboy, it still has potential. Phenomaman has clearly latched onto Robert emotionally, and the alien hero is looking for something new to be passionate about after his breakup with Blonde Blazer. Comparing it to Waterboy, the relationship with Phenomaman always has a more humorous side, since every other sentence has some kind of misunderstanding or play on words thanks to his alien origins, and this holds it back from having the more sincere edge that Waterboy's scenes do. But that doesn't change the fact that the writers are at least aware enough of the potential of a relationship between Phenomaman and Robert to want to constantly make jokes about it. Whether you find that to be in good taste or not is up to you. So with episode 4 ending how it did, with Phenomaman or Waterboy freshly recruited by Robert, you can see why shippers started to do what they do, especially with Nick Herman bashfully egging them on. However, the most popular candidate and arguably most likely was instead the focus of episode 5, so let's address the flaming elephant in the room.
Oh, sounds like hip-hop, but it's not, because then the white guitar come in, the white guitar,
Whether you fell in love with him immediately or it was hate at first sight, by the end of Dispatch, Flambae proved himself to be one of the most deceptively deep characters in the cast, a depth that reveals itself largely through his relationship with Robert. Unlike most of the cast who meet Robert during the game, Flambae and Robert already knew each other. Well, Flambae and Mecha Man, Robert's former hero persona. As Mecha Man, Robert was responsible for capturing the reformed villain before he was reformed, and the fight led to Flambae losing 2 of his fingers. Robert seems to have a knack for maiming the other man, since during an encounter in episode 1, while Robert is still disguised as Mecha Man, you as a player can choose to douse Flambae with a glass of water or vodka to discourage him from attacking Robert, with the water making him slip and lose a tooth, and the vodka lighting up and singeing off his eyebrows. This, of course, further riles up the already temperamental villain-turned-hero's beef with Mecha Man, who he is unaware is about to become his new dispatcher under his civilian identity. I don't want to stray too much into summary territory, you can play the game or watch a cutscene movie, but Flambae isn't too fond of Robert out of the suit either, and the pair spend the first 4 episodes bickering, sassing each other, all with a hint of banter. Both of them at least have a sense of humour after all. This is also a good place to point out that Flambae's sexuality is explicitly established in the early episodes too. While the voice lines can be missed if you aren't paying attention during dispatching, or if you manage to take Flambae out of action, these lines are pretty common to come across in a standard playthrough.
What's a good line to text a guy in a blackout? You know, like, what's a good, blackout game? For those keeping score. Made out with another British guy last night. I thought ghosting was when you stop texting the guy back. The Bone Zone said I am a closeted homosexual. Since when? I skipped the closet and went right for the clubs.
These confirm that Flambae has at least some form of attraction to men, but then after asking on the mythical Discord server of Truth, a different staff member confirmed that Flambae is a gay man. Clearly they need someone else for when it comes to actually confirming gay content in the game. While the inclusion is relatively subtle, and most gay people could have just told you he's gay by how he dresses, it's still nice to get official confirmation. And having Flambae being the only officially confirmed gay character, you can see why people might have started to think that his and Robert's heated relationship might have developed into something more passionate. However, the peak of Flambae's narrative relevance is in the 5th and 6th episodes. Like I said, I won't get too deep into summarizing, but we get more of a look into their dynamic, their history, and Robert has the option to reveal his hero identity to his team of reformed villains, including Flambae, leading to an explosive reaction if he chooses to. It's a perfect level of melodrama for what could have been a generational enemies to lovers. Instead, Flambae gets over it off-screen, shows immense emotional maturity and growth, and is then sidelined for the endgame plotline to kick in. It feels like what we see is a timeline of what would have happened if Robert doesn't choose to romance him. But who knows, maybe I'm seeing things. Also, just a brief point about our charming contestant, and not to preach from my woke soapbox, but Robert is never confirmed straight. In fact, he manages to make just enough jokes about his potential sexual attraction to men and puts himself in just enough Achillean scenarios that it seems like the subtext is just becoming text. And this is far from solely my own observation.
There's a lot of room to interpret Robert being at least bi. Him asking Roy to shake his pants again, and even blushing at him when his robot is being fixed. That scene where he gets very close to Waterboy's face, not complaining at all about Phenomaman's kiss, or hugging him naked, and etc. This wouldn't be as big of a problem for me if romance wasn't one of the main things in the game, you know? Straight guys don't deadpan brag about their head game to women they're interested in.
People don't think about much when I blow 'em.
Anyway, that's a sufficiently well painted picture. Game show's over, time for the verdict. Is this actually queerbaiting? Accusing ad hoc of queerbaiting is not a statement that will go unchallenged. Actually, you don't even have to accuse them, you just have to allude to the possibility.
It doesn't queerbait. People are just upset that this story doesn't have gay options and that it's ultimately a story about a straight dude, because those aren't allowed anymore or something. Ignore them. Whatever hyper online forums you're spending time around that inspired this question, stop going there. Some people make being offended their profession. It never ceases to amaze me how they can make stupid drama and outrage out of nowhere.
It's tiring, and it's a conversation reminiscent of any debate surrounding queerbaiting. Not everything has to be gay, you're not owed anything, it's quite literally nothing new. However, if we lay unquestionably shaky foundations with the Steam tags, but then build it up with a damning Discord message, and then take into account the trio of narratively available men, sprinkle in the signature plausible deniability, yes it is queerbaiting. Which feels strange to say, because games don't queerbait. When I had the idea to explore Dispatch and its queerbaiting, I knew I would want to talk about other famous or at least notable examples of queerbaiting in gaming, but then I started researching and came back empty-handed. Searches for gaming and queerbaiting or any particular phrasing variation would just take me back to Dispatch. I immediately assumed this is just recency bias from search engines, but not really. There just hasn't been a queerbaiting controversy in gaming on this scale before. But why? Well, if we don't get queerbaiting in gaming, where do we get queerbaited? The most well-known examples are in TV series, or more rarely in movie series like the MCU for example. While it's an imperfect source, the Wikipedia page on queerbaiting is stuffed with examples from these kinds of media, but gaming doesn't even get a passing mention. So why is gaming as a medium mostly exempt from queerbaiting, and what made Dispatch exempt from this exemption? Serialisation. Serialisation, the act of something being made into a series, a TV series, a series of movies, and sure, we get series of games, but because of development time, they don't tend to have interweaving narratives and continuous casts of characters that are needed in order for queerbaiting to be possible. But this isn't the case for all games. Dispatch is a serialized game in the traditional sense of serialization. It was literally broken up into episodes which were released in weekly batches like a TV series. However, Dispatch isn't the first game to have this release strategy. As mentioned, Ad Hoc was established by former members of Telltale Games, a developer that was defined by their episodic release structure. Don't Nod, most well known for the Life is Strange games, is another studio known for publishing a lot of their games using an episodic release structure. So if episodic games are nothing new, why has it taken so long for a queerbaiting scandal to happen? Well, if you're familiar with these studios I just mentioned, you'll know that they have/had a pretty great track record with queer rep. Telltale Games regularly included queer characters with multiple examples in their Walking Dead games, and for Don't Nod, every protagonist in the Life is Strange series has had a same-sex romance option, and their lesser-known 2020 serialized game Tell Me Why has one of gaming's rare trans main characters, Tyler. Historically, if episodic games have gotten anywhere near queerbaiting, they've just kind of followed through, dropped the baiting, and been queer. Of course, this wasn't a set rule that all episodic games were sticking to, but it did seem like they were sticking to a precedent to not be dumb enough to pioneer queerbaiting for a new medium. So why in the big year of 2025 would Ad Hoc, or at least some people in Ad Hoc, want to take that plunge? We can never know exactly why Nick Herman decided to tease a queer romance in Dispatch at such an opportune time, but there is one running theory that carries a lot of weight: lying for fun and attention. Well, mainly attention. Sure, on its merits alone, Dispatch would have been able to maintain a respectable level of social media presence, but let's be real and not underestimate the raw power and omnipresence of shipping culture. And yeah, shipping Robert with his ad hoc prescribed good girl or bad girl is all well and fine, and a fair chunk of people did, but indulging in some man-on-man action hits a wide, very online, very passionate audience like crack cocaine. I think I've said this already, but I would know. Various pairings, triangles, and I'm sure squares of these four men especially, and I say this lovingly, were clogging social media feeds for weeks last year. While it wasn't solely responsible for keeping Dispatch in the public eye, it was a large contributor to its continued trending and just building a healthy fandom. Fanfic and art being produced at an inhuman rate, and that level of supplementary material to help keep your game relevant is more than some devs could dream of.
They don't care about representing queer people, but didn't want to alienate them, so queer people were baited and exploited for sales.
These are of course allegations, but based on the context you can see where these feelings are coming from. Regardless of Flambae's sexuality, Ad Hoc isn't giving the impression that they value queer gamers, just their time and money. I don't want it to feel like I'm suggesting that everyone discovered Dispatch because of the shipping culture that was perpetuated by the queerbaiting. The game got plenty of attention thanks to its stacked voice cast, with gaming influencers voicing multiple characters and big names like Aaron Paul for Robert. However, while I learned about Dispatch from standard gaming news sources per usual, the game became inescapable once the social media hype took over once the first few episodes were out. This was a new game from a new studio with staff like Nick Herman coming from Telltale, a studio that went bankrupt after running out of money. I can imagine they would be hesitant about wanting to do anything that might dampen the excitement of such a wildly successful project. So as much as it feels like this section leans a little into conspiracy, I just can't think of any reason why you would tease content you know for a fact isn't included. Sure, he said spoilers, but like I mentioned, you can't spoil something that isn't there, and a much more appropriate response would have been just a simple no. This also feels like an appropriate point to reveal that Herman apologised on the Discord server after his faux pas was repeatedly brought to his attention once the final episode had released.
When we responded to pre-release romance speculation, it was always to confirm that we had no intention of revealing any part of the story before the episodes released. After a while, we turned to playfully dodging these repeatedly asked questions, but I apologised if it felt like we were being purposefully misleading. That was never our intention. We'll be more thoughtful about this kind of thing moving forward. Thanks for sharing your feedback.
Just a brief bit of advice for anyone who needs to apologise for anything in the near future: any version of "I'm sorry you feel" makes you sound like a disingenuous accountability dodging arsehole. Is Nick Herman a disingenuous accountability dodging arsehole? I didn't say that, but this apology sure makes him sound like one. This statement frustrates me because we just don't get anything new from it. It just goes back to the same bogus spoilers point and doesn't really show any awareness or compassion for the impact of his dense, and I'm going to be generous here, mistake. I do really think that is generous though, because even passionate Dispatch defenders seem to be able to see through it without even wanting to admit it. After creating a post to ask why people claimed that Dispatch was queerbaiting and then getting an onslaught of replies, OP edits their question with their conclusion where they state,
So yeah, no bait. They definitely could have just flat out answered when asked about it, instead of giving a very misleading answer. Poorly handled and looking for additional sales, but I don't think particularly targeted nor nefarious.
Sure, you can say you don't think it's queerbait, but if you then go on to describe queerbaiting and say, oh, but it's not nefarious, then it just makes you sound like you're making excuses. But this is, in the end, speculation, and for all I know, Herman just made this statement because he was feeling quirky. Maybe he just thought queer meant strange, like in the classical sense. However, the intention doesn't really matter, because with situations like this, the impact is often just as interesting. I was aware some people were hoping there would be a gay romance in Dispatch while the episodes were being released. It's why I held off on playing until late November, because I wanted to be sure I knew what I was getting into before playing it. But also I was enjoying Hades 2 and wanted to finish that first. I'm not going to blame other people for getting swept up in the hype. However, I didn't know the depth of the queerbaiting allegations until stumbling upon this Reddit post on r/gamers, gamers with a Y of course, titled Popular Games You Will Never Play and Why, with Dispatch's poster attached as OP's answer to their own question. While this of course spawned a good few responses of people giving their own answers, it then led to discussions surrounding why OP decided to choose Dispatch, and when asked, they directly answered.
The queerbaiting bothered me. Choice games are usually a solid way for gamers to get representation by being allowed to pursue options like that. Like if you want a certain protagonist for your game, that's fine. But don't omit that because you worry about loss of sales for your title. Robert is straight. Cool. Teasing the idea that he isn't so we don't cancel pre-orders or spend money on the game is fucking bullshit.
And after reading this, I just rolled my eyes. However, I had no other context, so it led me to further investigate the thread. This is where I found out about the Discord message, saw my first glimpse of debate surrounding the Steam tags, and slowly went down the rabbit hole of realising that these claims of queerbaiting weren't shallow and were fully justified. Skip ahead a bit and now we're here. Like I mentioned, ardent Dispatch fans don't take accusations of queerbaiting lightly, but even I, a card-carrying gay, was quick to doubt, mainly because I enjoyed the game. A knee-jerk defense of something you enjoy is easy, but this has been, for me at least, a healthy exercise of critiquing media that I'm still a fan of. I'm at peace with the fact that Nick Herman had a massive creative input on one of my favourite games of last year, but also made an ill-informed public statement on behalf of said game, teasing queer content that he was fully aware didn't exist. However, if I knew the full extent of the queerbaiting beforehand, it likely would have turned me off and maybe I just never would have played the game. It makes sense why the reactions to the queerbaiting in Dispatch were so visceral. Gamers aren't used to getting queerbaited, the medium just isn't built for it. So when Dispatch found a way to do it, people, gamers with a Y specifically, were pissed.
Lack of queer content doesn't make me not buy a game, but queerbaiting will. It just pisses me off so much, even if it's trivial. It's not trivial when I've been a gamer for 30 years with scraps of representation.
Gamers are used to not getting much representation, getting bad representation, but very rarely getting teased with representation and getting it yanked away, and you can see the sting of that here. But it's never that simple, because I would argue that gamers with a Y shouldn't miss out on Dispatch just because of Herman's dumb mistake. I'm not saying he specifically deserves your money, but he was far from the only person to work on the project, and the game does include some great queer content. Like I mentioned, Flambae is canonically gay, and the way he presents us, his relationship with other characters, Prism in particular, his dialogue, his characterization, his development, his stupidity, it all contributed to him becoming one of my favourite characters in gaming in recent memory. Genuinely, on top of all the game's other positive qualities, his scenes are enough for me to recommend the game on their own. However, just because Flambae is gay doesn't mean that the game didn't queerbait. Herman's message was specifically in reference to a romance option, and as gay as Flambae is, he's still not romanceable. So honestly, the judgment is yours to make, but I hope I've been able to fully inform you. A final point though, and something to chew on, the contextual form of queerbaiting Dispatch is guilty of is interesting, because you can play the entire game as a queer player, as I did, not knowing any of this, and experience the game unbaited. Others were still queerbaited though, but the product itself is, in isolation, out of context, innocent, and I think that's why I'm not as viscerally bothered by it, rather just frustrated that it's tainted by these what I could best describe as marketing choices that surround it. So while Dispatch itself is innocent, I would allege that Ad Hoc isn't. Also, be careful who you trust on Discord, but that's just good life advice.
1, 2, 3!
Thanks for making it to the end, but in the effort of keeping this video shorter than some of my others, I cut out quite a bit and saved it for the outro. This includes a more recent example of Ad Hoc's shaky relationship with the truth, the other gay character in Dispatch, another example of queerbaiting in gaming that I might have willfully looked past, and how you might be able to help me with a future video. So if any of that sounds interesting, stick about. However, before all that, thanks again for getting this far, and if you enjoyed, subscribing would be amazing. To get more of my opinions on Dispatch, and to see how it compared to everything else I played last year, you can check out my very chunky ranking of what I played in 2025. Or if you want something that's a bit closer in style to this, you can check out my video on bisexuality in gaming, focused on the alters. Anyway, now that mandatory plugging is out of the way, let's start getting through that laundry list. So I'm including this not because it really serves the overall point of the video, but instead because, at my core, by my true nature, I am a gossip, and it does feel at least partially relevant. This news isn't as fresh as it was a couple of weeks ago, but Dispatch was relatively recently ported to the Switch and Switch 2, and quite controversially launched with a heavy censorship of the decency toggle turned on by default, and you were unable to turn it off. Given Dispatch's sense of humour, this is pretty transformative and makes this version of the game inferior to versions on other consoles. What then followed was an inevitable backlash from fans and a series of statements from Ad Hoc, but more surprisingly, Nintendo as well. Ad Hoc initially characterized it like they were just working with Nintendo's guidelines, but Nintendo then clarified that they didn't force any changes on Ad Hoc, and then Ad Hoc finally relented and apologized for how they handled it. The running theory is now that the reason for the forced censorship toggle is that Ad Hoc didn't want to ship multiple versions of the Switch port to comply with Japan's strict age rating system. So instead of just making a censored Japan-only version of Dispatch for the Switch, akin to games like Cyberpunk, they just shipped the same version globally to save time and resources. allegedly, and because they haven't provided any other reason that would make sense. It's something that would be understandable with more transparency, especially from a small indie studio, but by instead trying to shift blame to Nintendo and not being transparent about the censorship in the first place, it built up bad will, meant people bought the Switch port without knowing about the issue, and it made me think that Ad Hoc need to invest in PR. This got a lot more publicity than the queerbaiting, understandably so given the subject matter, but I can't lie and say that this isn't a bit vindicating to see such a big example of Ad Hoc showing their arse by having a questionable relationship with the truth. But I don't want to feel like I'm constantly dogpiling on them. They still made a fantastic game. They shouldn't all suffer my ire just because a couple of spokespeople keep misspoking. It's a fantastic game which has some charming prequel comics which are canon, and while they aren't really relevant here, I just thought I should mention how one panel in the Malevola and Sonar comic seems to confirm that Malevola is attracted to women, or at least this one particular woman. Since I found this out pretty late in the video, and as far as I'm aware her attraction isn't referenced in the game, it would feel a little too nebulous to bring this up alongside Flambae, whose sexuality is comparatively a lot more on the nose. However, it's here, and I like Malevola, and if I get a chance to talk about her a little more, I will. Shifting gears a bit, it's something I wanted to mention when I was talking about how there aren't any big examples of queerbaiting in gaming. Well, that is still mostly true, but there is something that toes the line that I at least wanted to mention. Live service games, especially gacha games, have a serialized release structure that is, hypothetically, conducive with queerbaiting. I didn't want to bring this up for a few reasons though. Primarily, not my circus. I haven't played gacha games since I stopped playing Genshin Impact in early 2023, and I don't really want to dive into research for something that I'm so far detached from now. But with how deep I was into Genshin for a couple of years, I do remember the subtextual pairings that were the most popular, at least when I was playing. Jean and Lisa, Beidou and Ningguang, Chad and Zhongli, as well as Alhaitham and Cave. It felt like there was so much teasing, so many subtle lines of dialogue, that it might as well have been canon for at least a couple of those pairings. However, that brings me on to my second reason, and it's why I don't think they're actually queerbaiting. A lot of gacha games are developed in territories that have stricter guidelines when it comes to presenting queer content, with Genshin's Chinese origins as an example. Is it queerbaiting if canonizing could create legal trouble? I would argue no, especially when compared to LA-based ad hoc studios. But still, it's an interesting comparison and parallel, at least in my eyes. But I'm ultimately coming from a place of mostly ignorance, since I just don't play gacha games anymore. If you do though, let me know what I've missed. One last bit of housekeeping before I properly finish off. While I'm still in the very early stages of planning, I'm working on a massive video where I want to touch on as many games that include pretty much any queer content as possible. Of course, this is a pretty big undertaking, but the early stages have been made significantly easier thanks to the LGBT Games Archive, but unfortunately this resource hasn't been updated since 2020. Of course, I'll be able to do my own research, however, for the sake of getting other people involved and maybe being able to fill in some gaps I'll inevitably miss, if you know of, or especially if you're a fan of, any games that contain queer content of any kind, leaving a comment with an explanation or just a list of some of your favourites would be amazing. It'll be even better if they released after 2020, and especially if it's a bit more obscure, but genuinely whatever you've got will be useful. I know I'll be working on this for a while, but I'll leave an indicator in the description that I'll update if I don't need any more suggestions. For example, if I've already almost finished working on the project, or if it's already been posted. Now that's all done, thank you so much for reaching the real end of the video. This outro has been a bit chunkier than usual, but I just had quite a bit I wanted to get out of the way. I don't have any other major updates besides the fact that my channel turned 4 earlier this week, so thanks to everyone who stuck about, whether you've been here since video 1 or just this one, I genuinely appreciate it the most. If you want to keep up with what I'm posting, subscribing goes a long way, and if for whatever reason you're interested in what I'm playing, you can follow me on Backlog too. But most importantly, thank you to everyone who helps me make these videos. V did an amazing job as a thumbnail artwork. This is a reference pose I've been wanting to use for ages, and I love their interpretation, so go check them out on Twitter. Annie helped me a bunch by going over the script with me, and Jay's dulcet tones filled in for the quotes. They're my reliable helpers, and one day I will run out of ways to thank them, but that day has yet to come. If you're still here, I admire your dedication, so thank you too, and now it's over.